Drop that bass. Drop that
Look in my eyes, you will see there's so much more to me. A reflection of my life. See what you see. When all I wanna do is be in front of you, and all you wanna do is always bring me down. Try to understand, my stage is wonderland. I'm falling down below, catch the I'm a dapper, I'm a glitter girl, I'm a motherfucker here to rock your world. I feel my soul is ending my whole life. We're doing this, look inside ya.
Shortly after the release of Rare's GoldenEye 007, development began on a new first-person shooter. According to GoldenEye's director and producer Martin Hollis, when the opportunity came up to work on a game based on the next James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, Rare rejected the idea without hesitation. After having spent the past 3 years working on GoldenEye, the team felt they already spent too much time in the James Bond universe and chose a science fiction setting due to their interest in the genre. For this next game, a woman was chosen as the central character, partly because Martin Hollis believed that more games should be centered on women. Plus, after having just created a game starring a man, it seemed logical to now create one around a woman. At the same time, they wanted to forgo her having the appearance of a supermodel, but instead appear quite normal, perhaps even a little androgynous. When creating this character, the team looked to various female figures in media for inspiration. These included Kim Kimberly, the female protagonist from Level 9 Computing's text-adventure game trilogy Silicon Dreams, Agent X-27 from the 1930s film Dishonored, the main protagonist of the French film La Femme Nikita, and the FBI agent Dana Scully from The X-Files. The character's name would be Joanna Dark, taken from the French pronunciation of Joan of Arc as Jeanne d'Arc, a strong female icon in history who was vulnerable, feminine, and yet capable of killing. For the game's setting and plot, the team was significantly influenced by the Japanese anime film Ghost in the Shell, the novella The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, which featured a fictional organization known as Yoyodyne, more on that later, and the writings of author Philip K. Dick in the 1982 film Blade Runner. When choosing locations for the game's setting, Martin Hollis and fellow designer David Doak picked locations that would be impressive and architectural, on the model of GoldenEye but in a sci-fi dystopia. As a result, the settings took priority over the game's plot, and David would put them together in a somewhat cohesive order after the fact. Originally, Hollis wanted the difference between light and dark to be a significant feature of the gameplay, something that would be reflected by the game's title. Steve Ellis, the developer primarily responsible for the multiplayer mode in GoldenEye, had implemented a flashlight to be used in the game, but the feature was not included in the final game due to hardware limitations. While the game was unable to feature the light and dark mechanic envisioned by Martin Hollis, it still featured a much more advanced lighting system compared to GoldenEye, which allowed for things such as lights that could be shot out, rooms that could be illuminated by gunfire, and the player being able to use infrared and night vision goggles. The word dark was chosen as part of the title for its association with the game's bleak focus on killing, making the game essentially nihilistic or destructive. It was also meant to elude the possibility that Joanna has no heart, or that she is at sea without a moral anchor or compass, much like the player, albeit within their virtual world. The title featured a double slash symbol in the logo, which was inspired by the Japanese Dakuten mark, an allusion to Hollis's affection for the way Japanese developers used English words in their own games. In Japan, the game was originally considered to be titled Akatakuro, which translates to red and black, but it would later become closer to the game's final title, Perfect Dark. Development would span over the course of 3 years using a modified GoldenEye engine. Perfect Dark faced numerous delays and troubles throughout its development cycle. According to Martin Hollis, each member of the team was asking for more than the other could give. After only 14 months, Hollis's involvement with Perfect Dark came to an abrupt end when he decided to depart from Rare. By the end of 1998, David Doak had also departed from the company along with Steve Ellis to form their own company. Around this time, Chris Tilston and a small team at Rare had begun work on a prototype for what was planned to be Killer Instinct 3. Rather than seeing Perfect Dark get scrapped and its team fall to pieces, the Killer Instinct 3 team stopped working on their game and went to work on Perfect Dark instead, with Chris Tilston stepping in as lead designer. One of the original members who stayed on the team was Mark Edmonds, who went from the main programmer of GoldenEye to the project lead of Perfect Dark. The game saw a comprehensive redesign with only the story and characters being the primary items that remained intact. Graham Norgett was the initial composer for Perfect Dark, but following his departure halfway into development, the music was completed by Grant Kirkhope. Having worked on GoldenEye, Kirkhope knew the team well and worked to get the futuristic atmosphere across in his musical pieces. He was also working on Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Tooie at the time, so he asked Dave Klinick, who had just been hired by Rare, to write music for the game's cinematic sequences. Perfect Dark was first announced in mid-1998 as the follow-up to GoldenEye and Nintendo's lead game at E3. It was originally planned to be available by Christmas of 1998, but faced numerous delays. With a number of the original team members looking to form their own company, not a lot of work was done in the first year of development. Perfect Dark faced another delay in the last 6 months because the game was originally planned to have an expansion pack included with the game, similar to Donkey Kong 64. Unfortunately, Nintendo went back on its promise, so a delay was necessary to see how much of the game the team could make work without the expansion pack. During this time, the team managed to include a lot of additional content, including an original cooperative mode. Despite having a release date that continued to be pushed back, anticipation and excitement still continued to grow thanks to numerous magazine publications. Rare even released a number of websites based on the companies in the game's universe to promote interest in the storyline. As part of their promotional campaign, Nintendo of America hired the model Michelle Merkin to portray the lead character Joanna Dark in commercials and in-store promotions.
Welcome to 2023. Big businesses now merge with alien nations. An ancient war is being fought under the sea. The president is about to be cloned. And it's your job to try and save the world. So you've got an important decision to make. What are you going to wear to work? From the team who brought you GoldenEye for N64, meet Special Agent Joanna Dark in Perfect Dark, where you'll find out that the only person man enough to handle a job like this is a woman. Perfect Dark, rated M for mature.
Perfect Dark became the most anticipated game known to be developed by Rare at the time and perceived as the best shooting game to ever be released. The game finally became available on the Nintendo 64 in May 2000, with releases in other regions the following months. Set in the year 2023, the game follows Joanna Dark, an agent for Carrington Institute attempting to stop a conspiracy by rival corporation Datadyne, a callback to the organization Yoyodyne. During another routine mission, she learns that Carrington Institute secretly operates an espionage group in league with an alien race called the Mayans. Meanwhile, Datadyne has secretly made a deal with a group of Scandinavians to assist them in acquiring the technology of another alien race called the Skedars. Throughout her adventures, Joanna Dark must rescue the founder of Carrington Institute, save the President of the United States before Datadyne assassinates him and replaces him with a clone, encounter a talking alien named Elvis from Area 51, who is key to stopping the conspiracy, and defeat the Skedars, who are in the midst of an interstellar war with the Mayans.
What's wrong? I have a headache. And with a head this big, that's no joke.
Perfect Dark contained 17 main missions which had an objective structure similar to GoldenEye that changed depending on the difficulty chosen by the player. Enemies also had a similar location-based damage system, and there were a wide range of weapons to collect ranging from the traditional to extraterrestrial. Levels consisted of large environments that could be explored, and mission types that ranged from stealth, espionage, reconnaissance to straight-up action. Players could also traverse the Carrington Institute and make use of a firing range that served as a sort of training tutorial that offered trials which, once completed, could unlock classic weapons previously seen in GoldenEye. Speaking of GoldenEye, Perfect Dark's multiplayer had the traditional deathmatch modes, among others, as well as cooperative modes where 2 players could go through the campaign together, or 3 players could take on the role of enemies against a single main player. As a result of Perfect Dark's ambitious development, the memory required for the game's cartridge took up to 32 megabytes of data, the same size as Jet Force Gemini. This allowed the option for high-resolution graphics, Dolby surround sound, and a widescreen option. Still, the Nintendo 64's expansion pack was required to access the game's campaign and most of the multiplayer features. There was full voice acting for all the dialogue, and conversations could be heard between idle guards. Characters were voiced by the developers and featured many of their faces too. For example, Joanna Dark was voiced by Rare composer Evelyn Fisher.
Put your hands up and step away from the alien. Don't make me tell you again, Doctor, and turn that laser off.
And Daniel Carrington, the founder of Carrington Institute, was voiced by Chris Sutherland.
We might still be able to help him, even after those butchers remove his personality. He thinks they'll keep a copy of it in a safe place. About time I called in some friends to deal with Datadyne.
There were also plans for a customization option in the game's multiplayer mode that allowed players to place a photograph of their choice onto their in-game character's face via the Game Boy camera and transfer pack, which could then be saved onto the controller pack. But this was later scrapped due to the sensitivity issues surrounding the ability to attack images of real people. Rare had reached another high mark as Perfect Dark was met with universal critical acclaim and commercial success. It was praised for its high replay value, deep single-player campaign, and vast multiplayer options. The production values were unprecedented on the Nintendo 64, or even rival platforms at the time. However, Perfect Dark was also criticized for having an inconsistent frame rate as a cost for the game's visual detail. After playing the finished product, Martin Hollis was impressed by the vast range of multiplayer features in the game that was initially never planned, while David Doak remarked that the game pushed the Nintendo 64 so far past its limitations that it proved detrimental. Unfortunately, despite its technical achievements, Perfect Dark would only go on to sell a fraction of its predecessor, GoldenEye, perhaps due to it being released at the end of the Nintendo 64's life cycle. Plus, there was the matter of requiring players to purchase a separate expansion pack in order to access everything in the game, significantly increasing the game's entry fee. That being said, the team was actually surprised that Perfect Dark sold as well as it did. At the beginning of the year 2000, while Perfect Dark was still under development, Nintendo of America announced another Perfect Dark designed for the Game Boy Color. At the time, Rare had its dedicated Game Boy team split into two. One worked on a Game Boy Color version of Donkey Kong Country, while the other worked on Perfect Dark, which was released 3 months after the console version to promote the N64 game. Set in the same universe but with a different storyline, the game took place in the year 2022, where Joanna Dark attempts to prove herself worthy as an agent for the Carrington Institute. Perfect Dark on the Game Boy Color was an action game presented from an overhead perspective, with the main campaign consisting of missions that offered various objectives and a number of different game modes. As one of Rare's final titles for the Game Boy Color, the developers made sure to benefit from every technological trick the handheld was capable of. So the game featured full-motion video cutscenes with vocal tracks, a built-in rumble feature, and compatibility with the Game Boy printer. There was even a multiplayer mode for up to 2 players that could be accessed by connecting 2 Game Boy Colors together using a link cable. Still, the game received a generally mixed reception and was criticized for its poor and difficult gameplay. About 9 months before Perfect Dark was released, story and model designer Duncan Botwood left the Perfect Dark team to work on a third-person action game codenamed Velvet Dark. The project didn't come together due to the technology being utilized and was cancelled after about 2 years of work was done. Eventually, Rare began development on what was planned to be a prequel for the Nintendo GameCube. The initial development team started with a group of about 8 or 10 people. According to lead designer Chris Tilston, the game was in its prototype phase where the team was still discovering where they could go and how they could get there. For example, the multiplayer mode was initially designed to be played offline because the team was told that the GameCube would not support online play. This game made its first appearance at Nintendo's Space World event in 2000, where it was featured in a brief demo showing a 3D real-time render of Joanna Dark. At the time, it was reported that the next Perfect Dark game would have a number of possible titles like After Dark and Perfect Dark Evolution. It was eventually announced by Nintendo that the next game would be called Perfect Dark Zero and would be pushed back to 2004 due to internal team problems at Rare. For starters, Mark Edmonds didn't want to work on another first-person shooter and tried to make an MMO on the GameCube, leaving the team with an untried and unproven lead programmer. After Rare was purchased by Microsoft in 2002, it was soon announced that the game would transition to the Xbox and be redesigned to support Xbox Live. The team's new lead programmer would then leave following the purchase because he didn't want to work for Microsoft. When all was said and done, it took almost 2 years before the team could get a great lead programmer. To make matters worse, the team was forced to use a game engine shared between projects at Rare, which didn't work out well for them either. At one point, the game would feature up to 50 players simultaneously, but the graphics couldn't handle it, so the number was reduced. By the time the game was about 12 months away from completion, it was switched over again to the Xbox 360. However, this move gave the developers more possibilities to include what they wanted, since the initial version of the game pushed the original Xbox hardware to its limit. For example, according to senior designer Duncan Botwood, the Xbox 360 allowed the game to have a unique cooperative mode playable over Xbox Live, a feature the development team was very proud of including. The Xbox 360 allowed for the game to feature a brand new physics engine and more advanced graphics. Joanna Dark was given a redesign by UK manga artist Will Overton, which gave the character a more cel-shaded graphical style. According to Overton, the team wanted to bring Joanna back to the way Rare does things, stylizing her up a bit while making her more iconic. At the same time, the management was very keen on pushing cel shading, so the developers literally had to fight with them over how the game should look. That lasted the duration of the project. The team later settled on a more realistic depiction, toning down the styling a bit to create a sort of hybrid between a Japanese and Western comic book look. Later, it was announced to be a launch title for the Xbox 360, which resulted in a number of features getting cancelled. Some of the lost features included reducing the multiplayer limit from 50 to 32, and a mode that allowed players to upload and watch multiplayer matches over Xbox Live. Final development for the game became so rushed that Rare was ordered to produce the disc for the game 5 days before certification was completed by Microsoft. It was a significant risk because it would mean around 700,000 discs would be produced without checking the game for any technical problems. According to Botwood, there were very few people who believed the team could finish work on the game by the Xbox 360 launch. Fortunately, everything came together in time, and Perfect Dark Zero was released at the same time as the Xbox 360 on November 2005. The game takes place in the year 2020, 3 years before the events of the original N64 game. Joanna Dark is portrayed as a young bounty hunter who works alongside her father Jack and computer hacker Chandra. A rescue mission in Hong Kong results in her first encounter with the Datadyne Corporation, who are once again attempting to acquire an ancient alien technology. Eventually, she is taken in by the Carrington Institute, with whom she must stop the founder of Datadyne before he unleashes a superpower from an ancient alien artifact built by the Mayan aliens. Perfect Dark Zero's main campaign consisted of 14 missions and retained a lot of features from the original game, such as the difficulty-based objective system and the 2-player cooperative mode. The game was played primarily from a first-person perspective, but would occasionally switch to a third-person perspective whenever the player performed an evasive dodge roll or took cover as a defensive or stealth option. The number of weapons the player would carry were now limited to a 4-slot system, though the player was able to change the weapons and gadgets carried at the beginning of a mission, which could result in playing through the mission via different routes. Multiplayer had the traditional deathmatch modes along with a new Dark Ops mode that was slower paced and revolved around players purchasing weapons from stock credits earned from killing enemies or completing objectives. There were plans to release more content originally cut from the game, like more multiplayer modes and a counter-operative mode similar to the one found in the original Perfect Dark, but due to technical issues and pressure from Microsoft, much of the planned content was cancelled. Perfect Dark Zero faced a very divided audience when it was initially released, but still received positive reviews overall. The game's soundtrack, composed entirely by David Klinick, covered a wide variety of musical genres for a sci-fi setting, making it one of the best soundtracks of the year. Its numerous multiplayer options were praised, but many of the single-player aspects such as the story, voice acting, and poor artificial intelligence were largely criticized. The graphics for the game were considered impressive and served as a good visual showpiece for the new Xbox console, but it was also plagued with numerous technical bugs and glitches that would have to be fixed later through a patch. The game sold more than 1 million copies worldwide and was considered a commercial success, but since then, it has become viewed as a disappointment among fans of the series. To many fans of the first game on the N64, Perfect Dark Zero failed to live up to the expectations established by its predecessor. It either tried too little or too hard to play like the original and came off feeling mediocre as a result. Perhaps it was due to this perception that many people believed that the game was a commercial failure, but due in part to its small development team, Perfect Dark Zero reportedly made 4 times its production costs back in revenue. Releasing the game at the launch of Xbox 360 also allowed it to acquire a higher console attach rate compared to the original Perfect Dark on the N64. Prior to Perfect Dark Zero's release, Microsoft arranged several deals with a number of different publishers to promote the game. 2 novels were written by comic book author Greg Rucka titled Perfect Dark Initial Vector and Perfect Dark Second Front, which took place after the events of Perfect Dark Zero, but before the events of the original Perfect Dark. A trilogy was originally planned, but only 2 novels were ever released. A 6-issue comic book series was also written by Eric Troutman and illustrated by Cold Fusion Studios titled Perfect Dark Janice's Tears, as well as a special comic book included with the limited collector's edition of the game titled Hong Kong Sunrise. In the years following Perfect Dark Zero's release, there wasn't a lot of news from Rare or Microsoft regarding another game in the series. Although it was never officially announced, development on a sequel to the original Perfect Dark started at Rare under the title Perfect Dark Core. Development began in 2007 for the Xbox 360 but was eventually cancelled. The team that worked on Perfect Dark Zero were the only remaining developers who had worked on the series and still remained at Rare, but this team was later divided into smaller groups to work on a number of prototypes for potential future games. Rare developer Chris Seavor and the team responsible for Conker's Bad Fur Day was supposedly placed in charge of the project. According to reports, the game was intended to introduce some kind of morality system where the choices made by the player would affect the overall storyline. Perfect Dark Core would supposedly have a more realistic atmosphere compared to its predecessors and feature a more flirtatious Joanna Dark. But as development progressed, the game's focus shifted to a first-person shooter where the player controlled a male character instead. By late 2008, the development team had only completed 1 level for the game, and, as it had still not been greenlit, the team was reduced to only 3 developers, effectively putting the game on hold. Eventually, the game was cancelled as a result of a restructuring at Rare by Microsoft that occurred in early 2009, but by then, the game barely resembled the Perfect Dark game it began as. Despite the troubled development and eventual cancellation of Perfect Dark Core, Microsoft has shown that there is still interest in the franchise by re-releasing the first Perfect Dark on Xbox 360 in 2010, with numerous changes such as enhanced graphics and online multiplayer. Development was handled by 4J Studios, the same developer responsible for the Xbox Live Arcade ports of Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. By the end of 2011, the game reportedly sold over 400,000 units. Perfect Dark is one of Rare's flagship franchises whose successes came from a result of undesirable circumstances. The man who was responsible for the project's original vision was replaced midway through its development along with other key members. As a result of this transition, a lot of the publicly released information regarding their level of involvement in Perfect Dark's development shouldn't all be taken at face value. Keep in mind, this was a time when a lot of the people who left the GoldenEye team were setting up their new companies, so it would have been in their best interest to take as much credit as possible for everything they worked on, even if it meant stretching the truth at times. Meanwhile, the team members who stayed at Rare were not in a position where they could speak on the claims others were making. The final product was still an incredible game worthy of being a successor to GoldenEye, but it was hampered by releasing far behind schedule and requiring an extra add-on purchase to play it, which greatly affected its potential sales. While those numbers ultimately don't matter for all the players who enjoyed the game, those factors had a great influence on the game's potential audience. Perfect Dark Zero had an even more troubled development history due in part to not starting off with the right team and constant management interference that resulted in a game that faced backlash from fans of both Nintendo and Microsoft. Players' expectations and the standards for video game development have become more demanding over the years, and given the troubled history that came from making a potential third game, it seems that a new Perfect Dark game has become a much more difficult proposition for both Rare and Microsoft. By the time Perfect Dark Zero was complete, the game had already been in development for 5 years and 3 different platforms. During its lengthy development cycle, Chris Tilston laid witness to the rise of development costs between game platforms. Before, the development costs were minimal, which meant games could easily be profitable with a few programmers. The team for Perfect Dark Zero consisted of about 25 people for the majority of its development, which was incredibly small compared to the current standards of around 100 to 200 people on a team. Being a part of Microsoft's game portfolio, the Perfect Dark series is forever destined to be compared to their other first-person shooters, which have both surpassed Perfect Dark in terms of commercial success and are seen more as the leading innovators. Even its predecessor GoldenEye would continue to be iterated upon in a number of new video games by other developers. While this surely had more to do with the stronger marketability of the James Bond franchise, it would still inspire a number of imitations to the original N64 template, including a full-on remake in 2010. Once again, Perfect Dark has become a victim of undesirable circumstances because it's no longer believed to have the audience it needs to remain relevant. While Joanna Dark remains one of the best female protagonists in video game history, Perfect Dark no longer has the same recognizable status of other video game franchises, whether they are driven by female characters or otherwise. The possibility of a new Perfect Dark game starring Joanna Dark is always brought forward to Microsoft, and while they still value the franchise, a remake of the first game isn't enough to satiate the fans who would much rather see a brand new installment. Even though Microsoft has said in the past that it's a subject they discuss a lot between their teams, it makes a bit less sense in a world in which they already have Halo and Gears of War. That being said, it doesn't mean Perfect Dark will never return in some form or another. Joanna Dark has undergone multiple transformations and changing visions from different teams and designers throughout all of her known existence, so it's just a matter of time until the right team comes along with the right vision. History has shown that as long as people still remember and value a video game franchise, there will always be an audience yearning for it, which means there will always be a chance for Perfect Dark to return. Next time, in part 9 of this rare retrospective, a group of developers take a dramatic change in direction to the company's storied history of character platformers. In doing so, they not only produce one of the strangest video games to come from the company, but what remains one of the most bizarre and outrageous experiences to ever be released upon an unsuspecting public.
Ah, you cursed squirrel, look what you've done! I'm flushing! I'm flushing! Oh! Ah! No!
Now that's what I call a bowel movement.